In this interactive video, we're going to talk about architecture, and particularly, we'll just look at some general concepts of architecture, and then more specifically, how architecture as an art form helps to reveal our values. So a good distinction to make first is the difference between architecture and civil engineering, which are similar, but there are some critical differences. So both civil engineering and architecture are involved in planning and designing structures. But architecture focuses more on like the spatial functionality and the aesthetics, the sensory appeal of the work. And it's more concerned with like the artistry and the look and feel and the functionality of the design, with the livability and the appearance, right? The artistry of the building is of primary concern to an architect. But a civil engineer concentrates on the structural elements of the design, and makes certain that the structure can endure normal and extreme conditions. So if architecture has a tendency, these aren't mutually exclusive, right? If you drew the Venn diagram of the two, there's overlap. But if somebody pinned you down and said, what's the difference? You might say that architecture is more of an art form, where civil engineering is more of a functional and instrumental craft. So architecture is the shaping of buildings and space, and fortunately for us, they can often be works of art too. And essentially, at its heart, architecture can make our living spaces more livable and more beautiful. So just some real famous buildings here. This is St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, the Parthenon in Athens, Taj Mahal in Agra in India, the One World Trade Center in New York, and the Museo Sumayo in Mexico City. And architects work with the concept of centered space. And centered space is the arrangement of things around some other paramount thing, right? It's like the place at which other things seem to converge or zero in on, or it's something that draws your attention in, and trying to make that space a beautiful place that enhances whatever it is that magnetic draw to that particular space is. That's kind of the notion of centered space. And sometimes that center is like a natural site. It could be like a mountain or a river or a canyon or a forest. And sometimes the center is a natural site that's enhanced by a human-made structure. So the structure is built around the natural site, and it's meant to enhance it and not intrude upon it. That's the idea, essentially, of centered space. And real quickly, this is the Yasaka Pagoda in Kyoto, the Berlin Cathedral, some medieval homes in Amsterdam, and the Parliament building in Budapest. So centered space is centripetal, and that means that it draws us in. It has a centripetal force. And it's important to remember that we perceive space not as a receptacle, like a box or a receptacle that contains things, but rather as a context that's energized by the positioned interrelationships of things. That's the frame of mind that an architect wants to be in. You don't look at spaces like, oh, there's a big wide space, we can put a bunch of crap in it, right? It's the idea that an architect tries to bring to their designs is, how can this space be accentuated, and how can the inside and the outside work together to frame the natural environment and create an interrelationship amongst the landscape. And centered space has a pulling power, right? That centripetal force that's hard to escape. This is the City of Arts and Sciences in Spain, and this is Ho Chi Minh Mausoleum in Vietnam. And this is Medieval Citadel in Romania, and this is the Sultan Ahmet Mosque in Istanbul. So continuing along the theme of space, the concept of space in architecture, architecture, as opposed to engineering or civil engineering, is the creative conservation of space. And architects perceive the centers of space in nature and build to preserve these centers and make them more vital. And architects encounter these centered spaces and see them as spaces that are kind of calling out for some kind of design or structure, a work of art. It calls to them, right? It's the art of saving and enhancing space. So these spaces of nature, they kind of, architects will say, they speak to you in a sense and demand protection, and demand enhanced. So the protection comes in the form of setting up some sort of structure that works with that piece of centered space and complements it rather than detracts from it, so that we end up wanting to save it rather than, mow it down or, clear it for a strip mall or something like that, right? So the architect typically shelters inner space from outer space in such a way that the interrelationships between those two are preserved. And this is supposed to evoke our participation. And this partitioning of space makes invisible air visible. So inside the building, space is filled with like stresses and pressures, meaning, walls contain you, and there are things inside that keep you from going here and there, for instance. But outside the building, space becomes organized and focused. So if you just take a look here, this particular building was designed, so inner space is designed thusly, and then this window frames outer space in a way that brings your focus to it, right? Same with a room like this. It wanted to create a harmony between outside and inside, and like a framework for what was going on outside. And same here. It's almost as if let's design this building so that we got a really lovely, almost like a painting, picture of the world outside, except it really is the world outside, right? Living space is another important concept in architecture. And living space is the comfortable feeling that you get when things within a space are positioned well. You could almost call it like feng shui. So living space promotes both freedom of movement and directional pathways. So when something is designed according to the principles of living space, it kind of tells you where you're supposed to go, but not in a forceful manner. It's designed so that you feel free to move about the space as you want to, but there is some organization to bring you from like one place to the next, as opposed to being crammed and crowded and forced walls and hallways leading here and there, and you have no choice. It's spread out, and it suggests where you ought to go, as opposed to demands where you ought to go. So if you think about it, taking possession of the space around us is essentially, it's like the first thing we do as infants and as babies. It's our first encounter with the world. If you watch babies, one of the first things they do is just try to manage the space around them, get out of their own heads and look, I can send myself over here and over there with my arm and my foot. You start to try to see what you can take over in terms of space and what space will allow you to do as a baby. So it makes a huge impression on you. The idea of space does. This is why it's so critical to architecture. Architects. So space infiltrates through all our senses, and our sensations of everything influence our perception of space in return. Continuing with living space, a building that lacks artistic qualities encourages us to ignore it. And you have probably experienced this in your own everyday lives. So normally we'll be blind to these sorts of buildings and their spaces as long as they're serving their practical purposes. So like if the roof leaks or a wall breaks down, we just see the building as a damaged instrument as opposed to a work of art that is attempting to um, center space and work within and with the environment. You just see it as, here's this place where I'm supposed to go to court, or here's this building where I'm going to stay overnight on my business trip, or here's this building where I'm going to, so terrible. I don't even know what this is, but it's awful, to do some awful stuff and get the heck right out of there, right? Otherwise, as we move through we become blind to these places when we don't have to use them. Right? Hopefully you don't have to use federal buildings too often unless you work there, but we kind of don't even notice them unless it's like, uh-oh, I have to go to court. There's the federal building. Or, oh man, I got to stay overnight in this hotel near the airport. Blah, there it is. Or I have to do whatever crappy thing is going to happen in here. Blah. Unless we have to do something there, they kind of disappear to us. So these are examples of buildings that are not designed as like living spaces and with centered space as a principle. A well-designed building, on the other hand, it brings us into living space again by centering space, and we become aware of the power and the feel of space. And these kind of buildings make a compromise, kind of strike a bargain between what it lets us do and what it makes us do, rather than just making us do stuff. Here's some more buildings designed with the living space principle in mind. So in architecture, there are 4 necessities, and these necessities are critical because architecture, unlike other sorts of like some other sorts of art, are public. Buildings generally have a social purpose and a function, and also many buildings require public funds. So more than other artists, architects have to consider the public. As opposed to somebody who's making a painting, who's painting whatever they like, for instance, and basically say to themselves, I don't care what anybody thinks of this. This is my art. The architect, as an artist, isn't afforded that same sort of like freedom from public opinion. So when designing their buildings, architects have to take into consideration these four necessary but interrelated components. They have to think of the technical requirements of the building, the function, the spatial relationships, and then also the revelatory requirements. And we'll take each of those in turn. So technical requirements, right? Most obvious of the four, because buildings have to be sturdy and they have to be long lasting. So the architects have to understand their materials, what they're working with, and how those materials do or don't fit together. And they're faced with this unique challenge of having to balance this very important requirement, the technical requirement, with those three others we just mentioned, as well as the fact that they're artists. So, for instance, both civil engineers and architects have to deal with technical requirements. Function. Right? Traditionally, architects design their buildings so that they reveal and differentiate their function or use. For instance, office buildings versus churches, versus fast food restaurants, versus museums. They all have a certain look to them that helps to reveal what the building is for, what it's used for, and how the building functions. So imagine if you, for instance, this is the Museum of the Future in Dubai, real quickly though, versus the J. Edgar Hoover building in DC. I mean, imagine if you went to Washington, DC and you were hungry. You wouldn't see this building and go, oh, killer, I can get some El Pollo Loco here. Or, or you wouldn't go to some city that you are unfamiliar with and say, oh, it's Sunday, everybody, and we got to go to church. Here's the church. Or you wouldn't say, oh, I have to go file some important papers, patent papers with the government. Here's my building, right? You understand the point, is that architects have to make their buildings look like what the buildings are meant to do. So that's another necessity of architecture. Then, and the third necessity is the consideration of spatial relationships. So architecture as art has to be mindful of the space that the building will occupy. And optimally, the spatial relationships, both inside and outside of the building, should reveal both the form and the function of the building itself, as opposed to, say, a civil engineer that may simply be saying, look, we need a building in order to do X, Y, and Z. We want to cram as many people into there as possible, but as safely as possible. And let's get some cheap land to put it on. An architect has to, as an artist, has to take into consideration where the building's going to go, how it's going to relate to other structures, both natural and man-made, around them, and try to make them harmonious and beautiful. And then fourth is the revelatory requirement. That's the fourth necessity of architecture. So just like with other artists, architects are influenced by the values of the society in which they live. And buildings can, and very often do, reveal something about the values of the socio-historical and economic times in which they were built. So, for instance, the way that a prison is built tells you something about the values of the society in which you find this building, namely that prisoners should be locked away from other people and held out of sight and out of mind. That's not the way that every society looks at prisons. Prisons in the United States are more or less like this. Lock them away so that you can't see them, they can't see out, and sequester the prisoners from everybody else. That's not the way it is all the way around the world. Versus, let's say, some kind of futuristic building like this. This doesn't exist, but where they're trying to make it look as free and transparent as possible, right? A building like this would reveal something about the society you found it in. Namely, that we shouldn't shut ourselves off from nature. We shouldn't sequester ourselves from the outside. We want to stay a part of the natural world and be able to see it. So I'm going to quickly discuss 4 different types of architecture. The first is earth-rooted architecture, and that's architecture that accentuates the natural and the here and now. These buildings become symbols of the very place and space of our existence. And earth-rooted architecture often emphasizes security as well as like the mystery and life and death itself. And it can disclose these by carefully balancing sight and gravity and what kind of raw materials are used, and also centrality. I don't know if you've ever seen any buildings like this before, but these are all considered examples of earth-rooted architecture, right? Either just mimicking the mountains in the area, being built right into a hillside, right, with this one and this one, or right along, a stream or cascading area in a forest. Earth-rooted architecture. Then there's sky-oriented architecture, and that's architecture that accentuates like the transcendental or what's possible, and then the buildings become symbols of some kind of like ultimate truth possibly, and what we could be. So sky-oriented architecture reaches upward and into the sky to represent like possibility. And, often it's religious in nature, but it doesn't have to be. It's aspirational and inspirational. Sky-oriented architecture emphasizes sunlight, sky, and horizon, and it helps to disclose these by carefully creating what's known as an axis mundi, or like the axis of the world, through the defiance of gravity and the integration of light. So there's a bunch of examples, and then this is the Mormon temple right up there in La Jolla. Then there's earth resting architecture, and that attempts to balance both earth and sky more or less harmoniously, with earth as the foundation and sky as the backdrop. So earth resting architecture uses the ground like as a stage for the building, as opposed to integrating the building and the ground together. So it doesn't necessarily aim for fitting in with its environment, but it often does, in especially in more modern architecture. And this kind of architecture is often necessary in densely populated areas. And I know that these buildings don't necessarily depict densely populated areas, but nonetheless, they are examples of earth resting architecture. And then there's earth dominating architecture. And that type of architecture accentuates a power and aggressive dominance over the earth. And it not only doesn't try to fit into its environment, it tries explicitly not to. It tries to defy the environment. It's basically look at me and forget everything else architecture. So in this earth dominating architecture, the relationship between the building and the earth, it's not only neglected, it's outright defied. And some good examples of that are the Mysore Palace in India, the Chartres Cathedral in France, the Walt Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles, and the Guggenheim Museum in Spain. So we'll briefly talk about urban planning too. So the density of the modern city structure demands careful attention to the use of space. Space is at a premium in the modern city structure. So when this is overlooked, our cities appear disunified and cluttered and ugly. And like some buildings will be swallowed up by others, and there's a constant sense of competition amongst the buildings. It creates a tension just in the air, in your visual field. But some people argue that this is part of a city's charm. What are you going to do? That's a matter of opinion there. But in short, urban planning, or the lack of it, can reveal something about our values. So for instance, here's some bad urban planning, just to get an idea in your head. Like, this is a common freeway exit in the US. Really no urban planning. Again, it's like what would make this look good and be usable and livable and centered? All of that's brushed off to the side, and it's just for the sake of commerce and get stores in there and open up places in there. Is considered bad urban planning. Or this in Bangladesh. See what I mean about some places say, oh, that's part of its charm. It's really charming that there's this crazy intersection in Bangladesh where you don't know which way to go and you can't even get, I mean, look at that. I don't know. I would say perhaps if I was visiting there, that's part of its, that's part of its charm, but I don't know that I'd want this in my everyday functional life. You may feel differently. That's a matter of opinion. But nonetheless, this would be considered an example of bad urban planning. Or here in Sao Paulo, Brazil, where buildings just sort of, came up over time. And you can see the nature of these tenements over here. And then it's walled off for this nicer building right next to it with tennis courts and a pool, right? This, where there's, look at the sharp divide between poverty and between the have-nots and the haves. Let's put it that way. That's bad urban planning. Or the Pruitt Ego housing complex in St. Louis. So this is like not affordable housing, but government housing, low-income housing in St. Louis. It's since been demolished, but this is considered like a nightmare of urban planning. Like, here's just regular city that's propped up over, history. And then smack in the middle of it, put this monstrosity. And like I said, it's since been demolished. But here's what's maybe considered good urban planning. So this is Berlin, Germany, and Singapore cities. In Singapore is considered like a model for good urban planning. So is Shanghai in China. And then this too, in the Brasilia Central Axis in Brazil is considered a feat of good urban planning, where you've got, buildings and apartments and easy to travel streets all surrounding like a central plaza that you can walk through and eat in. It's multifunctional and it's easy to traverse. Really good urban planning is urban planning designed for human beings. And then finally, something about architecture and values. So for centuries, cultural and social ideas and concepts and values have shifted dramatically. So, for instance, old school industrialism to environmentalism, or the move to energy efficiency and alternative non-polluting energy sources is a big shift in our values. Um, or just increasing reliance on technology and social media for communication. That's a big shift in our values, but they all have something in common. The shifts are reinforced by society. We adopt them and accept them, and then they start to flourish, or we reject them and they start to perish. So it gets, there's like a cycle involved. So architecture reflects the values and successes and eventual downfall of civilizations over time. And it can help reveal these paradigm shifts through the use of artistic form, subject matter, content, and/or participation. So architecture and the buildings around us and our environment can help cue us into what we really, where's our money going? Where's our hard work going? Where's our effort going? Where's our attention going? So when you see buildings start to fall into disrepair or be abandoned, what you're seeing is that whatever is either going on in there, right? It could be because it's got functional problems, right? It could be rotting, it could be because it's no good, but it also could be that it just doesn't reflect modern values any longer. So it's going, I guess, out of fashion. So it's being left behind, as opposed to new structures that come up. And you can just pay attention to these to see how our, values from the past are going away and we're ushering new ones. Now look, this isn't available to see in everybody's neighborhood. You kind of got to seek it out. But certainly if you start to pay attention to buildings that are being left to rot versus ones that are being built, that's where you can really begin to get a clue about how things are shifting. And one example is over here. This is called the Bullitt Center office building in Seattle, and it was designed by Miller Hull Partnership for the Bullitt Foundation, and it was designed to be certified as what's known as a living building. So check this out because it's a total trip. I didn't know about this before I made this presentation. It's got a rainwater harvesting system that's capable of collecting and filtering 56,000 gallons of water. And it also has 5 aerobic composters, which treat human waste efficiently and odorlessly. And the building's rooftop carries photovoltaic cells, which generate 230,000 kilowatt hours per year, which is the needed amount to operate the building. So the building is like totally self-sufficient. This is incredible, a living building. As a matter of fact, I just read an article that says it not only produces the photovoltaic cells on its roof, not only produce enough energy to power the building, but it produces a surplus. So a building like this is strongly indicative of changing values, conservation, energy conservation, space conservation, aesthetics, clean energy, environmentalism are all kind of depicted and shown to us. All of those values are depicted and shown to us really in one look here. So we covered architecture in this interactive video, and specifically the concepts of centered space, space and architecture, living space, the 4 necessities of architecture, general types of architecture, urban planning, and architecture and values.